Hello, good evening. And thank you so much for joining us on this snowy night in Toronto. People have been filing in, finding us at the back of the public library. My name is Jennifer Welsh, and I'm the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. The Max Bell School of Public Policy is a teaching and policy-engaged research community where current and future policymakers come together in dynamic learning spaces and conversations that matter. And we think tonight is one of those conversations. And we're so pleased to be rounding off our annual economic lecture series here in Toronto and bringing the Max Bell School to you. This is our third and final lecture tonight in our lecture series that's called Economic Ideas for a Stronger Canada. I'd like to take a moment before we get started to recognize the land on which we are convening, Takaronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now, of course, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As we talk tonight about the future of Canadian immigration, we should also reflect on the history of the various peoples in this great country we call our own. So, the McGill Max Bell Lectures stem from a very simple yet also complex idea, and that is that Canada needs better public policies to address today's economic challenges. And so these lectures focus on the analysis, the rigor, the balance that are needed to plan for a more prosperous future. These lectures are made possible by a foundational gift from the respected business leader and McGill alumnus, Thomas Kierans, a major figure in Canada's business community for the last 25 years, as director and chairman of many successful national and international companies, and the former president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute. Through Tom's gift, he recognized the need for more and better debate about Canadian economic policy and Canada's economic future. And so I'd like to thank Thomas Kierans and Mary Janigan for their generosity. I'd also like to thank Tony Keller, this year's 2025 McGill Max Bell Lecturer. Tony, as many of you will know, is a columnist with the Globe and Mail. Over a career of more than 30 years, he's been an editorial writer, editorial board chair and columnist for the Globe, columnist for the Toronto Star, Report on Business Magazine, and Toronto Life, managing editor of Maclean's Magazine, editor of the Financial Post Magazine, and a TV news anchor on BNN Bloomberg. Born and raised in Montreal, he's a graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School, and he won Canada's National Newspaper Award for Editorial Writing in 2016. Tony wrote a terrific book for this lecture series, just the right mix of rigorous analysis and provocation and reflection. His book, Borderline Chaos: How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong, is a skillful capture of Canada's unique immigration story. Its ups and downs, good and bad. And the book also considers how the Canadian immigration system can be rebuilt better than before to once again benefit Canadians and immigrants and serve as a model for the world. In tonight's lecture, which is the third and last of our lecture series, Tony's going to explore the options for restoring the Canadian immigration consensus, rediscovering the immigration middle ground shared by most voters and most Canadians, and building a model immigration system that will benefit our society and our economy. Now, just to give you a sense of how this works. So Tony will be delivering some initial remarks, and then we bring to the stage, as we have both in Calgary and Halifax before, other analysts and commentators on immigration to share the stage with Tony. So in conversation this evening with him are Parissa Mabubi and Rebecca Young. So Parissa is an Associate Director of Research at the C.D. Howe Institute, where she leads the Human Capital Policy Research Program and chairs the Immigration Targets Council. Her research focuses on social policy, particularly immigration and demographics, education skills, and labor market issues. She has contributed extensively to Canadian public policy debates through her writing and appearance on panel discussions and at conferences. She also serves on the advisory board of the Education Promise, an initiative dedicated to transforming public education. Rebecca Young is an economist and vice president and head of inclusion and resilience economics at Scotiabank. Rebecca examines short and long-term economic developments that impact Canadians, including, again, demographics, immigration, housing affordability, fiscal sustainability, and the energy transition. She had senior roles at the International Monetary Fund, the Canadian Department of Finance, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. After Tony's remarks and that conversation, we're going to open it up to you for your questions, and we hope you will engage with us both during the Q&A and at the reception after the formal proceedings for tonight are over. So let me hand it over to begin to Tony Keller.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to move this out of the way. Hopefully you can hear me through this magical thing. No, a little louder. Let's tilt myself in a little bit more. Here we go. Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you all in particular for coming to the public library, the Toronto Public Library, which is where I actually researched a fair bit of this book. So I owe something to this building. The subtitle of my book is How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong. And tonight I'm going to start by talking about the second part of that, the How Canada Got Immigration Wrong part. And then I'm going to end by talking about how we can reset our immigration system to go back to where we were getting immigration mostly right, how to improve the system from there, and how to move us into a better future. In my book, I describe what happened in after 2015, and especially after 2020 as follows. Quote, "It was a deliberate policy, but it was also partly an absence of mind. It was like one of those aviation disasters where the cabin depressurizes and the pilots, unaware of their impairment by oxygen deprivation, start making what post-crash investigators will characterize as less than rational decisions." End quote. I say it was deliberate because almost everything that happened was the logical result of a series of government policy choices. And the Trudeau government repeatedly and clearly stated that it believed markedly higher immigration was both a moral good and an answer to Canada's economic problems. The government also agreed with those lobbying them from the business community, many provinces, and much of the higher education sector that along with higher immigration numbers, the Canadian economy also needed lower immigration standards and, in effect, much less border control and screening. So what happened was a deliberate policy choice paired with a kind of absence of mind or absence of thinking through. The inevitable consequences of the choices do not appear to have been considered or fully understood. There appears also to have been very little interest in measuring and understanding the potential impacts of each individual change in policy and how each of those policy changes and all their interactions would add up to a series of negative consequences that Canadian governments are going to be dealing with for some time to come. The outcomes were predictable, yet they were unpredicted by the people responsible for them. It was like the driver of a car turning the wheel and steering off the pavement, over the shoulder and off the road. and yet being sincerely surprised when the car ended up in the ditch. Also, the driver never told the passengers, the voters of Canada, where they were going. And none of the sweeping changes to the immigration system that took place under the Trudeau government were ever explained to the Canadian public or really spoken about at all. My impression, after following this issue closely for several years, is that the Trudeau government sincerely believed in what it was doing, and at the same time, genuinely did not know what it was doing or what impact it would have. It was very enthusiastic and at the same time somewhat ignorant. What has gone wrong is partly a quantitative story and partly a qualitative story. Immigration numbers increased sharply and immigration selectivity declined. The quest for much higher numbers powered the lower selectivity, and the lower selectivity helped drive the higher numbers. To appreciate what went wrong, it's important to understand how the old Canadian immigration system worked. So first of all, between the early 1990s and 2015, Canadian immigration was stable at around 250,000 permanent immigrants a year. Second, Canadian immigration levels during that period were actually fairly high by world standards. As I'll show you in a moment, they were consistently around 3 times the American immigration level. In fact, Canada's immigration rate has been higher than the US immigration rate virtually every year since 1900. Third fact about the traditional Canadian immigration system: permanent immigration, what Canadians think of when they hear the term immigration, was the bulk of our immigration system until the early 2010s, and temporary immigration was only a small part. Fourth, Canada's immigration system was partly about welcoming refugees, and it was partly about allowing Canadian citizens to sponsor close relatives, but it was mostly about independent economic immigrants. Those immigrants, usually around 60% or more of all arrivals in Canada, were mostly chosen through the point system. It was kind of like applying to a selective university where there were more applicants than places. A system of scoring had been devised to choose from among the candidates, and those earning the objectively highest scores were selected to immigrate. The accent was put on recruiting skilled and educated people to become future Canadians. Fifth, as I talked about in my last lecture in Halifax, Canada always put a lot of emphasis on border control and on making sure that before an immigrant was allowed to choose Canada, Canada had first chosen them. This Canadian paradox, or the Canadian paradox, pardon me, was that Canada was a high immigration country, yet also a strong borders country, and the latter helped build a foundation of public support for the former. Canada had more control over its border than other developed countries and was more selective about immigrants than other developed countries, and that sense of control and limits gave Canadians the confidence to embrace immigration levels higher than the rest of the developed world without political backlash, political polarization, or the deep disquiet in public opinion that you see in most other developed countries. All of that changed after 2015, and especially after 2020. Canada moved from a selective system involving a fairly large but stable, limited, and carefully screened number of permanent residents with a focus on recruiting people with above-average educations and skills to a system where most of the people coming to Canada were arriving on temporary visas, often with no screening at all, in numbers that were uncapped and theoretically unlimited, with an accent on prioritizing people to fill jobs at the bottom end. What's more, the evidence is that most of these temporary visa holders were hoping and are hoping to become permanent immigrants. And in many and possibly most instances, they were recruited with the expectation that it would be possible and even easy for them to go from a temporary visa to Canadian citizenship. So let's take a look at some of the data on what happened. I'm going to start with the smallest of the temporary immigration streams. It may surprise you that it's the smallest because it's the one you've probably heard the most about. It's the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Again, this is the smallest of the temporary immigration streams. And here's what happened to the number of temporary foreign workers in Canada between the year 2000 and 2024. In the year 2000, there were 22,000 temporary foreign workers. By the end of 2024, there were 236,000 temporary foreign workers. So the number of people in the temporary foreign worker program increased by about 1,000%. And again, this is the smallest of the temporary resident programs. Let's look at the next slide, which is a much larger, there we go, much larger temporary immigration route. This is foreign students. Let's see what happened there. In the year 2000, Canada had 123,000 foreign students. By 2023, Canada had more than 1 million foreign students. To put that in perspective, the United States in 2023 had 1 million foreign students. The Trudeau government goosed enrollment by allowing foreign students to work full-time while in school, and it made it easy to stay on with post-graduation work permits. That turned the student visa program into a low-wage temporary foreign worker program, and it quickly became much bigger than the official temporary foreign worker program. Most provinces, led by Ontario, encouraged their least successful and lowest tier institutions to recruit as many foreign students as possible, often in short programs offering limited value through strip mall campuses, what Immigration Minister Mark Miller would eventually admit were, as he accurately described them, puppy mills. Somewhat notional students paid tuition to no-name colleges in return for the right to legally enter Canada and to legally work in Canada, in the hope that some low-level work, plus a dubious educational credential, would make them eligible for the true prize, which is, of course, Canadian permanent residency. That's what they were paying for. And that is what most schools were selling. It was pitched as a best and brightest immigration strategy, but it was more of a cash grab. The numbers of students, as you'll see on this chart, rose in the late 2010s, and especially after 2020, but it was the quality of the students and the programs, at the same time, the quality of the students and the programs they enrolled in went down. For example, the University of Windsor the University of Waterloo got fewer than 1,900 new foreign student permits in 2023, and that was no more than it had received in 2019. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Conestoga College, there the number of visas more than quadrupled in 4 years to 32,000. So our boom in foreign student numbers here did not happen at Canada's MITs of the North. It happened at the puppy mills of Southern Ontario. We encouraged the most entrepreneurial institutions to fill their pockets, and they did. We gave them the power to sell entry to Canada in return for tuition, often very cheap tuition, and that's what they did. And that's what you see on this chart. Okay, next, let's look at an even bigger temporary immigration stream, which you have probably never heard of. It's the International Mobility Program, or IMP. This includes a number of different routes to temporary work. One of the biggest components is something I mentioned earlier, the postgraduate work program, which offers visa students an opportunity to extend their visa after their program of studies is over. So let's take a look at what happened here. The IMP program went from 89,000 people in the year 2000 to 1.9 million at the end of 2024. That's an increase of around 2,000%. Canada today has officially, according to the StatsCan estimates, 3 million temporary foreign residents, and it may have 1 million more than that, counting people who were supposed to leave after their visas expired but have not left. We're not really certain about that, and there really isn't any good estimate of that. Next, I want to talk about refugee claimants. When you think of refugees, you may think of the 40,000 Syrians who the Trudeau government brought to Canada from overseas in 2016. The numbers I'm going to show you in just a moment are different. These are refugee claims made in Canada or at the Canadian border. That means people who came to Canada on a student visa or a work visa or a tourist visa and then made a refugee claim, sometimes immediately after getting off the plane. It also includes people who crossed the Canada-US border to make a refugee claim. So, here's what we see in the numbers. In 2013, there were 10,000 people who made a refugee claim in Canada. At the height of Roxham Road, sort of in the middle there in 2018 and 2019, that figure went up to almost 60,000 a year. Then it goes down sharply during the pandemic, and then it really bounces back up. In 2024, we hit a high of 190,000 refugee claims made in Canada. The 2025 number is, I've annualized that to where things are likely to end up in 2025 based on the data we have. 2025 is actually lower, but it's still exceptionally high by historical standards. And again, 2024 refugee claims were 19 times higher than they were back in 2013. The next slide shows the consequence of the previous slide. If you get a tremendous number of refugee claims, you're going to have a tremendous backlog of people waiting to have their claims heard and decided. So in 2013, there were 5,000 people in Canada waiting to have their claim for refugee status decided. In the fall of 2025, that number is now 299,000. That's an increase of roughly 6,000%. And that has been going up essentially every month since the pandemic. I don't think there's been a single month where the number of claims processed has exceeded the number of new claims. So, what did all this do to the Canadian immigration system? It took a system that had been fairly stable, quite stable, through the Chrétien government and the Paul Martin government and the Stephen Harper government, Liberals and Conservatives, and it entirely changed it. Immigration numbers went way up, and the focus on skilled immigrants kind of went out the window in favor of a focus on recruiting people to work at the least well-paid jobs. And a system that had overwhelmingly been about permanent immigration was remade to mostly admit people through the side door of temporary immigration. Here's an illustration of what happened. The bottom line in blue that you see there is net temporary immigration. The red line is permanent residence, and the orange line is the sum of the two, total immigration. The lowest line, the blue line, net temporary immigration, counts people who came to Canada each year as temporary residents, less those who left. And as you see, until 2015, that number is very, very low. As a result, the traditional permanent immigration number, red, the red line, is basically the same as the combination of the two. Almost all the immigration is permanent immigration. In 2013, for example, which is actually one of the bumps upward in the blue line at the bottom, there were 53,000 temporary net immigrants. And historically, that was a really big number relative to what had come before. It provoked a public outcry and it provoked widespread criticism. The Harper government, which had allowed this to happen, said it would reverse course and that it would make it more difficult for employers to recruit low-wage temporary workers from overseas. In 2015, the net number of temporary foreign workers actually went slightly negative, meaning more temporary residents left Canada than arrived, which shows that the Harper government was in fact following through on its commitment. And then after 2015, what you see is all that changes. You see the temporary immigration figure going up between 2015 and 2019. And then there's 2020, the year of the pandemic, with a big pullback and borders closed. And then in 2021, starting in 2021, the temporary immigration number starts going to the moon and overall immigration with it. From the early 1990s until 2015, Canada's official immigration rate was about 250,000 a year. Total real net immigration, including temporary residents, was only slightly higher. That's the orange line in the chart. It goes up and down a little bit from year to year, but for a quarter century, it's basically flat. But the temporary immigration number shoots up after 2021. In In 2022, net non-permanent immigration was 10 times higher than it had been in 2013. That was the year that provoked a bit of a public pushback and caused the Harper government to pull back. The next year, 2023, it was 15 times higher than it had been in 2013. So the result is that in 2022, Canada took in 1 million immigrants, temporary and permanent, which means that the real immigration level that year was about 4 times higher than it had been for the previous quarter century. And then in 2023, Canada took in 1.3 million immigrants, or about 5 times as many immigrants as had previously been the norm. And in 2024, as the government began to feel public opinion shifting, it began to backpedal, but it still took in 900,000 immigrants. By the way, in my book, you'll see a lower number for 2024, about 750,000, but StatsCan recently revised those estimates upwards. Again, I can't stress enough how much of this was driven by the temporary immigration streams, which were very focused on people filling some of the lowest wage and lowest skill jobs. To get a sense of sort of how Canada compares to other countries, let's compare us to the most obvious comparator, which is the United States. And as you'll recall, the United States had its own fairly substantial post-pandemic immigration surge, and that surge at the US-Mexico border contributed heavily to Donald Trump's re-election in 2024. So this here shows the immigration levels in Canada and the United States since the year 2000. That's Canada at the top, that's the United States at the bottom. Each country's immigration rate is tracked relative to the size of the population. Canada's the higher line in red, the United States there at the bottom. You'll notice that until 2015, the Canadian line holds pretty steady, annual immigration rate just under 1%. And again, the rate I'm showing here is permanent immigration and net non-permanent immigration. And the US line was about a third the Canadian level, consistently, all the way through the 90s, the early 2000s, the early 2010s. From the Bush administration all the way through the Obama administration to the election of Donald Trump. So Canadian immigration in those times consistently about 3 times the US immigration rate, even before the arrival of Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau. And you see that after 2015, the Trump administration actually further lowers immigration. It dropped to about 0.2%, and the Trudeau government started raising it, such that in 2019, the year before the pandemic, Canada's immigration rate was roughly double where it had been during the last year of the Harper government. Then you have this big drop in both countries, that's COVID, and then in both countries there's this really big immigration surge. Between 2021 and 2024, the United States had the highest level of immigration in its history. So that was the conclusion of a New York Times analysis published in late 2024, which estimated that over the 4 years of the Biden administration, about 8 million people had immigrated. According to the Times, that represented a faster pace of arrivals than at any time in US history, including the peak years at Ellis Island in the 19th century. Even after taking into account today's larger population, the Times concluded that this was the most rapid increase in the US population since at least 1850. And earlier this year, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released its own tally, which was actually higher than the Times estimate. The CBO concluded that in just 3 years, between 2022 and 2024, the number of net immigrants, that is, people who came to the country, legally or otherwise, minus those who left, was 8.8 million. Again, just to stress, that highest level of immigration in American history is way below the Canadian line. That American immigration surge had a really big impact on US public opinion. It turned opinion that was already teetering on immigration pretty sharply against it. It helped to elect Donald Trump. So what you see there, though, in Canada, we actually had an immigration surge that was about 3 times the US immigration surge, and that US immigration surge was the biggest immigration surge in US history. So it's not surprising that there was a certain amount of public consternation and public pushback. So, what were the economic consequences of all of this for Canada? Until late 2023, early 2024, the Trudeau government thought that much higher immigration and much lower standards was going to power Canada to chart-topping economic success. The 2023 federal budget trumpeted that, quote, Canada's economy is now 103% the size it was before the pandemic, making this the fastest recovery in the last 4 recessions. And that was, in fact, true. A chart in the budget showed that Canada's gross domestic product had grown 2%, which was slightly higher than any other G7 country. And the reason for this was said to be, quote, strong population growth. The budget celebrated, quote, strong immigration levels, pushing population growth to its fastest pace since 1950. And this was said to be a big positive because, quote, immigration is a significant driver of economic growth. The more people arrived, the better the Canadian economy did, apparently. And in one sense, this was true. The Trudeau government had added and multiplied, but it had failed to divide. It had focused on the size of the pie while ignoring the number of forks and the number of slices of pie. It was taken with the idea that the more immigrants Canada added, the bigger the economy would be. It didn't think enough about how an emphasis on less educated and skilled immigrants might impact the economy. Nor was there any discussion of the likelihood that immigration levels could outpace business investment and hence lower economic productivity growth. Nor did the feds of the provinces do serious enough planning for how much higher population growth would need to be met by higher investment in everything from healthcare to social services to housing. There was a lot of single-entry bookkeeping. Higher immigration would have the benefit of making the economy bigger, but there really wouldn't be costs to worry about on the other side of the ledger. Over a period of 27 months, from the summer of 2022 to the fall of 2024, Canada had 7 quarters of positive economic growth and just 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. But per person economic growth, that's GDP per capita, delivered the opposite. 2 quarters of growth, 7 quarters of contraction. Canada's population was growing faster than the economy. Between 2015 and 2024, Canada was the rich world's poorest economic performer. Real GDP per capita, economic growth per person, less inflation, grew by 2%. Not 2% per year, 2% total over a decade. US GDP per capita was up almost 20% over the same period. By 2025, real GDP per capita was no higher than it had been before the pandemic. And given that Canada's population count is likely an undercount, with perhaps 1 million people in the country in excess of the estimates, that low GDP per capita figure was probably too high. It turned out that supercharged population growth via record high immigration growth was not a panacea for Canada's economic challenges. It was, if anything, making the challenges more challenging. Canada conducted a decade-long experiment. The experiment's principal investigator was the Trudeau government, assisted and enabled by the provinces, the business community, and an important part of the higher education sector. They were opposed by essentially nobody. The hypothesis of the experiment was that Canada, already one of the world's highest immigration countries, could jumpstart its slow economic growth through much higher immigration and markedly lower standards. The experiment has not been a success. The run-up in Canadian immigration after 2015, especially after 2020, did not prove that immigration is inherently bad or that however much or little immigration a country receives, it would be better off with less. But neither had it shown that immigration, of whatever type and in whatever quantities, is always and everywhere an unqualified economic good for the receiving country, and that however much immigration a country received, it would always be better off with more. The recipe for higher living standards was not stop immigration, but neither was it add as many people as possible, stir, and enjoy. What Canada's lost decade showed was that Canada's economic challenges cannot be solved by a crash program of sharply rising immigration. Things are just not that simple. Under the Trudeau government, the historical tilt towards high skills immigrants, instead of being further emphasized, was considerably watered down. Immigration levels in place for decades, higher than US levels as we saw, but stable, were increased and then completely outrun. And control over the borders, which underpinned the national belief that immigration was a choice of enlightened self-interest rather than an imposition, was weakened to the point of near abandonment. And for a long time, nobody said boo, because immigration, formerly a matter of practical trade-offs, had been transformed into an issue of values. Turned out the 21st century Canada could not bound up the world tables of economic advancement simply by having more population growth than other rich countries. And the secret to higher living standards was not lower immigration standards. So, where do we go from here? My advice is that we should aim to move into an immigration future that looks a lot like our immigration past, and then try to improve things from there. Just as the last few years have been a masterclass in how to get immigration wrong, the previous era got a lot of things right, and our first move is to get back to that. Underlying the previous government's immigration policy was a belief in what I call Big Canada. Extra fast population growth was the point of the Big Canada idea. I suggest we drop Big Canada and instead aim for Smart Canada. That means more measured immigration, like we had before, though likely still higher immigration than most other developed countries. But above all, the focus of immigration policy should be raising the human capital level of the Canadian population. The previous government got very focused on gross domestic product, the sheer size of the economy, and the sheer size of the population. The focus of policy, including immigration, should instead be on GDP per capita, which is to say focusing on how we can make the economy grow faster than the population, and how we can raise average living standards. So how do we do that? To start with, we've got to bring immigration numbers back down to a reasonable level. In my book, I suggest going to around 0.75% of the population per year of permanent immigration, which at Canada's current population would be just over 300,000 immigrants a year. That's a bit higher than where we were in the 90s, the early 2000s, and it's higher than what the Carney government is aiming for, but reasonable people can have a reasonable debate about this. Along with somewhat fewer immigrants, we've also got to get smarter. Part of our immigration stream is always going to be refugees, and that should continue. Part of it is always going to be family reunification, and that should continue. But the bulk of our immigration, I'd suggest about 2/3 of permanent residents, should be economic immigrants. And those economic immigrants should be chosen overwhelmingly through the point system. That means immigrants chosen not because a business claims there's a shortage of workers at some employer or sector at the bottom of the market, but because they have educations and experience that suggests that over a lifetime they will earn good and ideally better than average incomes than the average Canadian. Relying on the point system to choose economic immigrants will mean that more of them will have strong educations and strong skills, high earnings, and high earnings potential. Over the last decade, the system got torqued in the opposite direction. One of the things I argue for in the book is what I call moneyballing economic immigrant selection. Moneyball was a book by Michael Lewis, later a movie, that described how Major League Baseball teams started using deep statistical analysis of a player's past performance to figure out how players were likely to perform in the future. This is what Canada's point system has always tried to do, and we can get back to that, and we can do better than before. Another thing we have to do is bring down temporary immigration and focus it more on high-end workers and high-end students. We should, in fact, encourage top programs at top universities to enroll more foreign students. First of all, because those students will pay quite high tuition. Second, because those students are highly unlikely to make a refugee claim or to try to stay in Canada at the end of if they are not given permission to remain. And third, because top students at top programs who want to stay in Canada are excellent candidates for permanent immigration. At the same time, we should be discouraging or outright stopping the use of student visas for shorter and lower end programs. I talked earlier about the contrast between Waterloo and Conestoga College. Ideally, we'd have more foreign students at Waterloo and universities like Waterloo, and we'd have very few at Conestoga College. And the same goes for the temporary foreign worker program. It should be easy for a Canadian company to hire a high-end, highly paid worker if there is no one in Canada to do that job. They should be easily able to hire someone from overseas to fill that position. If we're talking about, say, senior engineer at Bombardier who makes $200,000 a year, or senior manager at Shopify. It should, however, be difficult and really impossible for Canadian companies to use the temporary foreign worker program to hire low-wage workers for low-wage jobs. And finally, we've got to clear the refugee backlog that you saw, which means speeding up the system by hiring many more refugee adjudicators, but also reducing the flow of applicants back to the lower levels of the past. That means being much more careful about who gets a visa to come to Canada as a worker, a student, or a tourist. In conclusion, the good news is that what went wrong over the last few years helps to point the way to how we can remake the system to do much better in the years to come, and to turn the Canadian immigration system into a clear economic positive for Canada, and thus something most Canadians will support and be proud of and feel good about. Above all, I want to turn immigration back into something that, like clean tap water or functioning plumbing, nobody thinks about. It just works. And hence, immigration would be mostly ignored because it was working. Turning immigration from a subject of conflict and polarization into one of general disinterest would be a great accomplishment. Canada did it before. Canada can do it again. Thank you very much. And I'll ask Parissa and Rebecca to come up. I'll sit in the middle. Yeah. I'll put that down. Whoops. That's going to roll. Okay, well, should I use this one? Yeah, we'll use this one. Okay. Thank you both very, very much for being here. I have sort of a million questions for you. Let's start with a little history. When did you first feel that something had sort of something or some things were going wrong with the Canadian immigration system? And Rebecca, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that at first, as an economist, we're forecasting GDP, and when we started to use the term human stimulus, that gave me a sense something's wrong. We're talking about how is Canada juicing the economy by adding more people, and to your point, as economists, we think you produce more output by adding more people, adding more tools, or how you combine those together. So I think when we started using those terms, that was a sign. But as we saw the numbers going up and up, that's when it started to look unsustainable. And then we started to see other metrics, whether it was house prices or rent. All indicators were saying it's no longer an economic number that's appropriate, because we used to think about what can the labor market absorb? It was now what can communities absorb? So that was, I think that was in 2023 when we started to see, okay, whoa, things are out of control.
Parissa?
Sure. In regards to, for example, numbers, just looking at whether the numbers make sense when the government started to increase permanent immigration numbers before even pandemic. I did an analysis just to see the justification for increasing immigration number to address aging issues. Just in regards, for example, whether we are able to reduce the proportion of older workers relative to workforce in the labor market. my analysis showed that it's not possible to mitigate some of the impacts through immigration, but the main concern in regards to impact of immigration on our economy and in terms of the selection, it was post-pandemic, when the government started to reduce the cutoff point for example, under the express entry, we started selecting immigrants that their score were lower and lower because we needed to meet the targets. When we focus on meeting the immigration numbers and target, we started reducing those cutoff scores, and after that, increasing the introduction of category-based selection. That was a warning sign. This was something that allow the government to even reduce cutoff score for economic immigrants further to meet the targets. But another warning sign was, and the biggest issue was temporary immigration, when we allow international students to work full-time, and when we, in terms of the cap on the number of temporary residents in low-skilled jobs, we allow employers to hire more in those categories. That was a warning sign, and because of two-step immigration, because we are using those temporary foreign workers for permanent immigration, we started to become worried about what's going to happen.
Yeah, and just to clarify there, when you're saying we sort of lowered the scores to meet the targets were number of people to come, and we kept lowering the score because we wanted the number, because the government wanted the number to go higher and higher. I guess I ask a big open-ended question again, because you're both economists. First a quantity question, and then I'll ask you a quality question. So quantity question, as an economist, why does it matter and how does it have an impact on the economy how many or how few people come to Canada?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's also a misconception that many people have, including I think some policymakers, which was that adding more people would, lead to improved welfare for Canadians. And ultimately, that's what the government thought they were doing. They were trying to, improve the welfare of Canadians, and they thought we'd juice the economy, create more output, and everybody will be better off. But just to give you two stark examples, like think of Sweden and Haiti. Those are two countries exactly the same size population, vastly different GDP per capita, vastly different welfare. And I could go on with lots of, examples. So it is not, how many people you have, it is the tools that you also give those people to produce stuff for the economy. And so even before, I think we have to be careful not to attribute a lot of Canada's structural weaknesses to this explosive population growth, because we were kind of growing on fumes before all this happened. And one of the things that we looked at as a country is we just weren't putting the tools into the hands of Canadians and businesses. So those tools, or what we call capital, was just flatlining. So I think that we were just masking for a while by adding more people. And I think what governments now are suddenly waking up to realizing, is that we need to add more tools. And so you see this at the federal level, this capital agenda. I'd put a little caveat that I worry that we're going to forget about human capital in that whole agenda. To your point, I still think we need to think about how do you also invest in the people.
Yeah, so, and again, just before I turn to Parissa, I think that's sort of really important, and I hope it comes through in my talk, and I hope it comes through in my book. My point is not immigration caused Canada to have this relatively long history of sort of insufficient economic growth and insufficient investment. It's just that higher immigration did not solve that, and the government's belief was, oh, we have this magic tool that can fix a whole bunch of things, just dramatically raise immigration. Anyways, for the question to you, what's the impact of, or as an economist, of considerably higher immigration quantity?
So in regards to higher immigration, if we are not able to invest enough in capital to be able to support the workers that we are adding to the workforce, we are going to have challenges and problems in terms of, for example, GDP per capita, because we are not able to improve productivity enough to catch up with the growth we need to be able to increase the standards of living. Another problem is that, for example, housing market infrastructure, health system. So the problem is that when we increase the immigration numbers significantly over 1 year, we are not able to expand our capacity to absorb them. So when population growth exceeds our capacity, that's a problem that we're going to have. And for example, housing market, housing supply takes time in Canada, and we know we are actually we are the worst country, and Ontario is the worst province in regards to, for example, increasing supply because of all the delays. So increasing immigration means that immediate demand for housing, immediate demand for healthcare and education system. And at the same time, workers, they need the capital and to be able to also even to use their skills. We are not able even to integrate immigrants effectively. It takes time for them to integrate into our labor market. All of these are going to create challenges when the growth exceeds capacity.
And then the second question is the quality question, which is, and I'll start with, we'll switch it up. I'll start with you and then go to Rebecca. Why does it matter who immigrates to Canada, what skills, what educations they have, and why is it better in some way to have higher income, higher education people?
So I think the goal of immigration should be to increase GDP per capita, to increase the standards of living. How we can do that? When we increase, basically when immigrants, newcomers, are able to earn on average above the average of existing population, we are able to increase GDP per capita, we are able to basically even bring up the earnings of all individuals in Canada. So that should be the goal even for our immigration, for our selection of immigrants. That's why we need to focus on immigrants. They have high potential of earnings, and they are able to contribute to an economy above the average earnings of Canadians.
Rebecca?
Yeah, no, I would entirely agree, but the math is even harder. So, you know, you talked about the economic immigration stream, which is just over 50% right now, and they're aiming for 60%, but that number actually includes the whole family, and so very roughly it's 1-to-1, one economic immigrant comes with one dependent, either a spouse or a child, so that means when you then layer on additionally the family reunification and refugee, you roughly have, you know, 1 in 4 newcomers to the country coming for a job, and so you need the math to work out that they have to punch well above their weight. Now the good news is that, you know, those coming in the high skilled streams are punching well above the average income of a Canadian, but we're just not, you know, applying that filter. And I would add, you know, you made the point very clearly that, you know, the whole point of immigration isn't just about economics. There are you know, refugee asylum seekers, there are other international obligations that are right, you know, that, but from an economic perspective, then you need to balance it out. So if you're going to take more through family reunification, you have to have an even more stringent point system so that you have even higher earning potential from those that are coming in on through immigration, economic immigration.
So going forward, you know, we are going to have somewhat lower immigration numbers. The federal government has said that. Can you talk a bit about the upsides and the downsides of immigration going lower in the years to come?
First of all, in terms of reducing the numbers, still historically we are going to have high immigration numbers. However, given that we had high, you know, years of high immigration, we need to adjust our expectation about what's going to happen to our economy. Because reducing the immigration numbers, it affects labor force growth, it's going to affect GDP growth. We have to adjust our expectation about, for example, employer numbers, even without any externality that could happen, you know, for example, trade tension or any other factors that could affect employment or job creation in Canada, just through immigration, reduction in the number and levels, we have to adjust our expectation. We have to be patient because it's going to be rewarding at the end, long term. We are going to benefit from this reduction. It's not sustainable to keep increasing immigration numbers just because we want to see higher employment numbers. But at the same time, it should be more about who we select than just reducing the numbers. Whether it's permanent immigration or temporary immigration, it's not just, we shouldn't really think about reducing the numbers. Numbers is one thing. Another, the most important part is that who we select and to which extent they can contribute to our economy.
So again, I'll turn to you on that, Rebecca. What, broadly speaking, what's the negative impact and the positive impact of immigration quantity going down over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think actually that they risk overcorrecting, and so their stated policies say that we'll have zero growth, and I think there's also and I would actually maybe challenge a bit on the temporary side and the low wage side is that I do think there is still a need for a certain number of in that category, and so it's not a perfect match that those that are unemployed in Canada now are not going to be a perfect match for where there's demand, and you look especially in healthcare and aging demographics that I think there's kind of a crisis, a slow burn crisis there, and we haven't figured that out. So I think that that there's a risk that they overcorrect, and that businesses legitimately looking to fill jobs aren't able to find the talent they need, but are not able to get visas in a timely way, including in the so-called care economy. That I think there's a risk then that we have a backlash, that we've got this like seesaw of like too much, too little, and not enough coherence. So that's kind of my worry of where they're going right now without and the other point I would just add too that I worry about is the reputational damage already caused, because I think we need to think about the experience of those that have come to the country where the governments have mismanaged the expectations, that many were coming with this expectation, and very tragic stories of what the sacrifices were that many have made to come here, and not just financial, only to find out that the rug was pulled out from under them. So I think, I worry that, that, for example, international students, that was a really effective program for Canada. Like, you couldn't design a better program to attract, talented young people that are going to be trained in Canada and are going to have a lifetime of paying taxes and working in a good job. And so I worry that those people are going to be a little bit skeptical about coming to the country now.
Yeah. I mean, I guess by the way, we're allowed to disagree here on stage. Where I disagree with you on that is my concern is that a lot of the people coming through the student program were not in particularly good programs. If they were in a good program, a high-end program, absolutely, we want more of that. But my concern is that there was essentially a lot of selling of permanent residency, temporary residency in the hope of permanent residency. But within that, you essentially have a huge pool of people who were under the impression, hey, I'm going to get Canadian permanent residency. And the numbers to me, I look at the numbers of temporary residents are so large, it's going to be very hard for all those people to get permanent residency. So we're in a bit of a bind. Okay, so as I look at what the Carney government is doing, I give them I have a positive score and a question mark. The positive score on the quantity side, I guess, is that they do realize, hang on, the numbers got a bit out of control, we need to rein that back in. On the quality side, on the sense of we also have to be very thoughtful about who we let in and how we select them, for me that's a question mark. I don't know how well the federal government, and especially the provinces who control some parts of the system, I don't know how well they understand the importance of focusing on quality when you're limiting quantity. What are your thoughts on where this seems to be going?
I've had recently some discussion with IRCC in regards to improvements to our point system. So I believe maybe, hopefully, there will be some changes. But in regards to the sense whether we are doing well in regards to quality, for example, when it comes to international students, we do really need to change the way we handle that. We need to reduce we needed to reduce the enrollments in international students, because majority of increase came from those institutions that you mentioned. So, and this is actually not federal government responsibility. We should make provinces accountable for that. This is something that we recommended in our publications, that the government need to revisit the list of institutions that they can have international students. If we are going to control those institutions, the number of enrollment is going to decrease, because enrollments in university didn't increase significantly even during the time that we saw significant increase in international students. It was colleges, and not all colleges, those that with 90%, 99% of students were international students, and we provided low quality education to those international students. And we brought those with the, with the message, and we advertised that you can become permanent immigrants. So we sold hope, and everything was wrong about our international students, but the program, it's great, two-step immigration and having education in Canada, it's beneficial for us, and the research shows that. But we got it wrong when we allowed all institutions to participate, and we allowed provinces to take to make all the decisions when it comes to international students.
Yeah, Rebecca, what do you think about the question of how well the government, federal government, and the provincial governments have grasped the quality issue going forward?
I would agree if there was nothing in the new immigration plan that pointed to, they had a couple of pockets of, we'll tweak these programs around highly skilled workers that we need for the build agenda, but there was nothing kind of system-wide, which is what they need. They need kind of, not to be picking the winners, but banking on the talent. And to your point, like, imagine if we had a magic ball to, predict the, the talent, who's going to succeed. Well, we do. We have this great longitudinal data that's been tracking for 25 years now, people arriving in the country with what credentials from where, and what their income and their potential is over the last quarter century. So we have all that, and it could be better, and Paris has been doing fascinating work on how to make it even better, but they're not using it. So even just using the tools that we have would be a start. But long-winded answer to say I haven't seen any sign that there's an intent to use it from what I read.
And I'll ask this question to Parissa, but you can also, jump in and answer it if you want. Parissa's done a lot of work on demographic impact of immigration, and in particular on this issue where a lot of people believe, it's kind of just a commonly held belief, including by, it seemed, the Trudeau government and most levels of government and most journalists, that Canada must need higher and higher immigration because of the aging of the baby boom, that it was just inevitable that you needed higher and higher immigration because of the aging of the baby boom. Now, you've done work on this that says, hang on a second, the math doesn't quite add up, you're not looking at it right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. The reason that, first of all, immigration is necessarily for the country. It's not like that we should close our doors, but immigration is not able to solve our aging problems on its own, and only through immigration. If we want, for example, just looking at numbers and, for example, old age dependency ratio, if we want to prevent Canada from aging by focusing on that indicator, it means that we have to increase immigration numbers significantly high, to the extent that we are not able to absorb that high number of immigration. So, and even high immigration numbers by recent trends that we saw, there is no way that Canada can stop, there is no way that we can stop Canada from aging, even with immigration rate at 1.2% of the population. There is no way. Canada continue to age, and Canada continue to grow, even with a small rate of immigration. So in the long term, we're going to have a larger population, we are going to have larger Canada and older Canada. We can't prevent that. What we can do is that to look at other ways to support our economy, to even support the tax base, and to be able to support the services we need in the future through other ways. For example, delaying retirement and also increasing productivity by making better decisions in terms of immigration selection, in immigration integration, and also increasing productivity. Other ways, encouraging, for example, increasing childbirth, it's going to be challenging, but maybe addressing childcare, improving childcare policy could maybe help. But in general, one thing that our research has shown is that looking at delaying retirement is more effective than increasing immigration.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that's about sort of encouraging people to delay retirement as opposed to
yes.
compelling them to keep working. Rebecca, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would agree with everything. Sorry about the numbers. And I go back to my earlier point without going down the slippery slope of just kind of how broken our healthcare system is right now. But my point was that we don't have the caring for humans, vulnerable humans, whether it's aging or whether it's persons with disabilities, is very hands-on, and so that's one sectors that we aren't going to be able to automate, and we wish AI could solve those problems, but they won't. And so I worry that immigration won't solve that, but it can have the potential to make it much harder. And even we saw in the budget that there was a measure for support workers for a tax deduction, but only for those that are working in an institution or a facility. So, but most Canadians say they want to age at home, and so if they're going to be looking for hiring care, whether it's Canadian-born or other, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult. And yeah, so I agree it's a problem, but immigration can't solve it. It can make it a little more difficult, though.
And we should realize that immigrants age. So one of the reasons that even though we are focusing on young immigrants, but at the end, they are going to age. It's not going that Canada remain young.
Yeah, and in my book, I mentioned, in addition to citing your research, I mentioned another economist who pointed out rather obviously that immigrants have parents. And they will either bring their parents to Canada, or if their parents remain overseas, they will send money to their parents to assist them. That one way or another, we don't have people, the idea was sort of like, oh, these 24-year-olds with no children or parents will fall from the sky and make our population younger, but it doesn't really work that way. In just a moment, we're going to go to questions from the audience, but before we do that, I just want to ask both of you if there's anything in particular you wanted to say or wanted to add, or something I should have asked you about. Rebecca, anything you want to hit on?
I don't think. Maybe somebody will ask me the question from the audience. Nothing burning.
There's one thing I wanted to mention when you talk about government's plan in terms of improving quality. Government increased PNP, the allocation to PNP programs.
And just to be clear, PNP is the Provincial Nominee Program. So this is permanent residents essentially chosen by the provinces.
By provinces,
yeah.
Yes. So the government significantly increased their allocation. So now provinces, they are selecting a larger number of immigrants. And the problem with this program is that majority of people selected through this program, they are not going through express entry, because the provinces, they selecting, they have a list of occupations, and for Ontario, for example, it has a big list of occupations that individuals, they don't need even any, with high school diploma at most, individuals can work in those occupations. So those individuals, they are not able to go to the express entry, and that's a problem. Provinces, they are not doing well when it comes to selection, either temporary or permanent immigration, and the federal government actually increased their share into the selection of permanent immigration. So that's the problem that I think I have written on that, and I think that's the big issue.
Yeah, essentially in sum is that the federal government has handed more of the immigration system over to the provinces, and the provinces have said, great, we're not going to use the point system to evaluate people, we're going to name particular jobs, many of which happen to be kind of low-end jobs, as the priority for immigration. Yeah. Okay, we can go to questions from the audience. I think we've got a microphone. Yeah, there's a microphone up here. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone. And please say a little bit of something about yourself or your institution, affiliation, whatever it may be, and then please ask your question.
Thanks very much for that. Very interesting talk. You've all thrown lots of darts at the government and government policy, but at what point would you attribute some fault with industry? Because there's plenty of anecdotal evidence of industry not being able to absorb the immigrants that are coming in. It's one thing for government policy to dictate that high skills of a certain flavor might be required, but then if industry is unable to recognize credentials, et cetera, where does that fit into this equation?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I'll try to answer that a little bit, and I'll turn it over to both of you if you want to say anything. But I would just say that this has kind of been a generalized failure in the sense that the private sector broadly advocated for much higher immigration and to make it really easy to bring in low skills people. The provinces pushed for it, in part because they were being lobbied by business. A large part of the higher education sector pushed for it, in part because provinces were squeezing their budgets. So there's a lot of blame to go around.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and I've written about that Canadian companies underinvest in people and they underinvest in capital, and so I had proposed an easy fix that businesses apply for various tax treatments when they make investment in capital, and so why not reward the companies that are doing both, investing in the tools that people need, and then reward them with immigration or temporary or permanent residence, because I do think that's an issue. We don't want to force people to stick with a company, which is a bit of a market failure that businesses underinvest in people because they move around, but we want them to move around, so we have to come up with better policies so that Canadian companies are investing in people.
You're absolutely right. When it comes to, for example, permanent immigration, integration issue that I mentioned, employers, they are not hiring immigrants for occupations some of occupations that they are actually claiming that they have shortages. At the same time, they want more immigrants, but they are not using the existing immigrants that they are unemployed, and they are not also investing enough, or either in the workforce or in capital. They are not making capital investment, and the biggest problem is the wage growth. So when they are not investing in individuals and they are not investing in capital, and they're asking for more immigrants and more especially temporary foreign workers, because they don't want to increase wages. And definitely there is a role for employers to address integration of immigrants and also make sure that existing population, we have specific groups with high unemployment rate, and also we have many unemployed people, even in those specific occupations with those specific skills. The problem is that employers, sometimes they don't increase wages enough to attract individuals looking for jobs. They should advertise their jobs.
Yeah, this is sort of like economics 101. There's no such thing as a job no one will take, but there are jobs that people will not take at a low enough wage, and so we actually want those wages to go up at the bottom, and this system was essentially short-circuiting that. Sir, your question.
Hi. My name's Brian. I'm 85 years old. I've been a Canadian all my life, and the country I have now is certainly nothing like the country that I grew up with. You've been talking about jobs, and I think one of the things that I am told about, and I think I see, is immigrants who want to come into this country who are highly skilled, and they come into this country and we refuse to accept any of their skills. People who've had 5, 6, 7 years of education are required to go back and do the whole thing all over again. It's almost as though we're working as hard as we can against them. If you look at medicine, God knows we need more and more doctors, and we make them go back and take training. I mean, somebody who's graduated from some of the top, say, British schools of education are certainly qualified to practice medicine in this country, and yet they have to go back and take it all over again. So why are we working out of our way to make it as difficult for these people as we can?
You guys want to answer that?
You are absolutely right in that regard, and to be able to address that, when it comes to credential recognition, there are two issues. Some of the issues is related to the host country that my research and even research by others have shown that education quality is not similar across all institutions, even within Canada, so imagine other countries. The quality of education is not similar across all institutions in all countries, and even within one institution, students, they have different level of skill set. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to assess a skill, and we are just looking at education level, but there is a way to be able to address that to some extent. We do have organizations that they evaluate education credential of those individuals. We have to do better because we do have some information about how different institutions in other countries are doing in terms of the quality and the type of education they are providing. We need to use those data and look at the type of immigrants that they were successful in terms of integration and focus on those specific institutions, and also start the integration process earlier before immigrants arrive. So for example, in those immigrants in specific occupations that they are regulated, they can start the process of, for example, getting their license before arriving to Canada. And also provinces, they can do better, and hopefully we are going to see some progress in that regard, given that, for example, the trade tension and even within Canada, we have that problem. Individuals from one province going to another province, they are facing the same issue.
Do you want to add anything on that, Rebecca?
No,
I could say a bunch of things about what goes on in healthcare and with doctors, and I think a ton of that has to do with the fact that we actually try to repress the number of doctors in the country because we have a public healthcare system, which is insane. It's upside down, doesn't make any sense, but that's the way a lot of provinces conceive it. But we can talk about that afterwards if you come meet me in the reception. Okay, next question, please.
It might be a bit of a long question. I'm Rosemary Frey. I'm a recovering investigative journalist. And I loved when you mentioned Moneyball, Tony. And I mean, I guess the Dodgers obviously are experts at Moneyball, but so we could apply that to the question of how many people.
I think they may just be experts at spending money.
that helps, it's true. So the question is, what's the right number of people in the country? And we could use the Moneyball approach, but does that take into consideration things like cohesiveness in society, which is many of us would think I think it's significantly declined, and there's a cost to that. So, and I think this won't be solved. I don't think this can be solved, whether it's by economists or politicians, because the question is, what is best for Canada? Right now, we mostly have business people running it. Like you didn't mention, but the Doug Evans's book, Maximum Canada, and the whole project with him and others like Mark Wiseman, they're business people. So they want to suppress wages. There's a whole agenda, one could argue, behind that. So do we want business people running it, or should we have at the table colleges and your average person? And that, I honestly don't think that's going to happen. So to get Moneyball, well, we're not talking about money, that wouldn't be appropriate, but to have what do we want, and to arrive at that, just like they know in baseball, you want to win games. Okay, that's a nice, clear thing. We don't have that with immigration, because there's so many competing agendas, many groups, many of which have more power.
So on moneyballing the immigration system, it isn't that my reason for stating that is not to say that would be the way to pick the appropriate number of immigrants, but it would be a way to say who are going to be the immigrants that we choose, at least through the economic immigration stream. That was sort of my focus. My hope is, and I say this a number of times in the book, that instead of just having a series of lobbyists lobbying for particular interests, that there's somebody up at the top thinking about the national interest. And my concern is that the federal government, for a number of years, and the provinces as well, just didn't think about the national interest. They didn't think about long-term impacts. They just thought very short-term. And they thought, well, if all the people lobbying us are telling us to do this, then it must be a good idea. And I don't think there was any deeper thought than that. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would say I agree. Like we don't have the right accountability metrics either for what Canadians expect, and it's not just about money. I think GDP per capita is kind of the closest metric we have that leads to higher wages that Canadians can purchase and invest what they need, and governments have the revenues to invest in services. But we don't have the framework to hold people to account. But there is some great data. Like Canadians are asked, "Are you satisfied or not?" And we have the Centre for Canadian Living Standards has analyzed that. So I'm from out east on the Nova Scotia, and on that part of the country, they're more likely to say they're happier, but their health is worse and their incomes are worse. Their sense of community is higher, and so we need to look at those components, like what leads to Canadians ticking that box is that they feel good. And I think we're seeing weak sentiment, even as economists, we're trying to scratch our head, like why are Canadians feeling so poorly these days? And and it can be housing affordability, it can be all these services that aren't showing up in GDP per capita that are impacting how Canadians are feeling or whether they're feeling hopeful. So I think we're missing the accountability and the frameworks to think about what is going to improve the welfare of Canadians.
We will try to keep our answers short so that we give you guys time to ask your questions and get everybody to the bar. Okay, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Samir Anuti. I work for the United Nations Population Fund. I would like to first acknowledge Tony, the speakers, as well as the McGill's Max Bell. I'm a proud father of 2 McGill alumni, so my first question, and it's really important, this discussion, it's not only relevant to Canada, for us in Canada, but also beyond. And part of our work is to do similar analyses and to aim to identify good models or good practices between countries. So that's why. So the first question, and I'm grateful for Rebecca for bringing this comparative example between Sweden and Haiti, is how careful should we be in limiting our assessment of the impact to only few elements or aspects of the economical impact? That's the first part of it. And then the second one, it's mainly to Tony, is how much do you think that differences between provinces, so the policies and the say they have in this, still can make a difference in going to the better path? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the question. I'll answer that second question. Parissa touched on it, and it is her concern, and it's my concern that the provinces are not turning on the quality issue, that in fact they shifted to a low quality economic immigration platform, and they seem to mostly be continuing in that direction. So I'm actually concerned on that. I'll let you guys answer anything else you want.
No, I would just, hats off. I think we didn't even talk about the international aspects as much, but, Canada's not the only aging society. It's not the only one that, we look at the US and we see them closing their borders, but the rest of the world is also kind of trying to come up with strategies for, rejuvenation and smart strategies. So we're competing, so we need to, keep that in mind.
And the rest of the world is also freaking out over immigration, which is where I don't want Canada to go. I mean, if anybody's paying attention to the news, you'll have noticed that the United Kingdom right now, under a Labour government, is really trying to close the border and to convince voters that it is closing the border out of fear that the next election will be won by a very, very right-wing, absolutely anti-immigration party. Okay, sir, go ahead, please.
Good evening. My name is Aftab. I was an international student, became a citizen quite recently. Max Bell grad and currently working with the City of Toronto for homelessness and housing policies. My question is around talent retention. I know we spoke a lot about talent attraction, but just based on sort of anecdotal conversations and friends, a lot of people are coming here as international students, getting professionally trained, working for a couple of years in Canada via the PGWP, but moving to the States. And I'm thinking about sectors like tech, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. How do we stop this brain drain that's happening? Because I know you mentioned we need to focus more on retaining high-skilled, highly paid labor. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you guys want to say anything about that?
One of our upcoming papers is on that topic, so I recommend you to read that when it's become published. But in regards to retention, first of all, it's not just temporary resident and international students. This is the challenge we have for permanent immigrants. The rate of immigrants leaving Canada has increased over time, and it could be the factors that can contribute to that is integration issues and also better opportunities elsewhere. So we live in a mobile world that people always look for better opportunities, and those individuals with a higher level of education and skills, they are able to find better jobs elsewhere, and they should actually look for that. So, but at the same time, we have also the same issues with Canadian-born individuals that they look, for example, for opportunities south the border in US. This is something that we are able to address that to some extent through providing better opportunities here, focusing on, in terms of the tax policy. This is something that we can focus on, but increasing GDP per capita is, and creating high quality jobs that provides better earnings for individuals definitely can contribute to that, because economic reasons are the main reasons for individuals to decide to move to another country.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we're talking about people who immigrated to Canada for opportunity and then said, oh wait, hang on a second, there's actually an even better opportunity next door. If I can get it, I'll take it.
You can't blame them.
You can't blame them. One of the things that I talk about in my book, and the Canadians don't realize about their immigration history, is that Canada was, for a good part of its history, an emigration country, not an immigration country. Canada actually had negative immigration from before Confederation all the way up to 1900, and that continued in various periods, really all the way to after the Second World War. Canada now is in a very different position than it used to be in, and so we worry a lot about brain drain, but in terms, and it's real, but in terms of sheer numbers, Canada is a huge immigration country and a small emigration country, but there are questions about who's emigrating, and they tend to be the most skilled people. Do you have anything to add to that? Next question.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jackie. I am also used to be an international student, proud Waterloo grad. So thank you for shout out from my school. I also benefited from the point system back in the day. So I appreciate a lot of things you're saying. Currently, I work also in public sector, public policy, intergovernmental relations. So I guess I have a two-part question. I hope that's okay. One is, a lot of the immigration policy making are at federal level, some at provincial, but provincially and municipally, we are bearing the burden. Like, for example, you mentioned housing, education, healthcare, that's provincially governed. Water, transportation, etc. is governed by city, or homelessness. I wonder what's your insight on how to fix those misalignment, because they're not. And from what I'm seeing, there's no intention to have those coordinated policy pieces. Federal's gonna go this or this, but provincially, municipality-wise, we just can't keep up or adjust like that. The second part is the more recently, because we're trying to correct this chaos. Specifically, I am curious to hear your insight on the category-based selection, because I agree we want a highly skilled immigrants with good jobs, high-paying jobs, but ironically, someone like me 10 years ago, I was able to immigrate, but today, because of the category-based, unless you are, I don't know, personal support worker, early childhood educator, trucker, construction worker, etc., or if you speak French, then I don't have a way to stay. So I want to hear your opinion on those pieces.
You've laid it out pretty well. The second part is really interesting and really troubling, and I don't understand why we've moved in this direction. It's just there's been lobbying to say, oh, there's shortages in these areas, like you said, personal support worker, whatever it may be. And look, there probably should be some category-based selection, but we've tilted really far in that direction. On the first part, I don't know if I have an answer other than this is basically what happened over the last few years, is that the federal government ramped up immigration and there was no planning. There was no like, hey provinces, hey municipalities, get ready, here's what's coming. Things just, the wave just came And later on, we had a discussion about, oh, yeah, we probably should have been prepared for that. You guys want to add anything?
On the first one, definitely when it comes to decision about the number of immigrants, government needs to take into consideration where they reside. And we do have the numbers, we know where immigrants are going to reside. And also, it's not just the first time they arrive to Canada. Immigrants, they move from one place to another after the arrival, sometimes immediately or sometimes after a few years. So there is a second round of immigration among immigrants. And we do have a data, majority, for example, they choose to come to Toronto, Ontario, but mainly GTA. So we do have those numbers, and the federal and provincial governments, they should use those numbers when they are planning for total immigration, and also when it comes to those provincial nominee programs, we have to take into consideration where immigrants end up living when we are deciding about those allocations. One more thing about category-based selection, definitely government needs to get rid of that. This is something that we have recommended, and that's not really economic decision.
Yeah, and I would just add on, sorry, on the first point about better numbers allows better planning, but we still then have a fiscal problem, is that municipalities don't have the funding mechanisms, the revenue mechanism to support this growth. So I think we've got, it's one thing to tell them how many people are coming, another mega problem to solve, how to fund it.
Sir.
Good evening, my name is Eric Kai. I'm a statistician and mathematician. In my day job, I work in the intersection of retail, grocery, and consumer packaged goods. In my spare time, I write a free newsletter called The Data Copywriter about statistics, communication, and career development. In 2025, a survey by homestars.com showed that 45% of Canadians find it difficult to find a reliable and trustworthy skilled trades worker for their contracting needs. And 31% of Canadians had to delay or even cancel a home project because they could not find an available contractor. I'm concerned that tonight's prescriptions about high-skilled workers and immigration coming into Canada is lacking this discussion about skilled trades. Based on your research, what does Canada need to do to increase the number of skilled trades workers, whether it's natively born or through immigration?
So I think this is a fantastic question, because when people hear high skills, high paid workers, they think, oh, you must mean people who, have a degree in anthropology. No, actually a lot of them would be tradespeople. Like, tradespeople make a lot of money. They're very good jobs. They're above average income jobs. So it wouldn't necessarily be a problem to have some of the immigration system perhaps be doing that. It's pretty clear we need to do a better job in that area. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I hadn't heard the particular numbers you've cited, but anecdotally, they sound pretty plausible.
So what's being done?
That's a good question. I am not an expert in that. But what I can tell you is that it doesn't look to me like, I know that the federal government's talked a little bit about using a little bit of the immigration system for this, but there's a reasonable question as to whether there ought to be more done in that respect, and as well within the visa student system. Because mostly what these colleges were doing was not training skilled trades workers. They were giving people one-year degrees in a nonsense course like international business, which wasn't really even a course.
Yeah, no, and I would totally agree that, I think that's going to be the bottleneck to this build agenda, and that's why I say I think they risk overcorrecting. So I think they do have, specific skill categories that they're going to try to expand. I think they're going to need that, but I really think it's not going to fix the shortages, and so I think they need to think more generally about, Canadians here, younger Canadians, people that are reskilling because we are in kind of a structural shock where some sectors are not going to be around, and so we need to think about even mid-career, how do we encourage or incentivize people to move into some of these jobs that'll be in high demand.
Please elevate this topic among your colleagues. I think it's severely under-discussed.
I have something to say. In regards to immigration, even before category-based selection, we had a program to focus on skilled trade. Within category-based selection, we have also right now a program that focus on these individuals. But I believe still through immigration, we are not able to increase the numbers significantly. It's not just because the design of our program, it's just the way that maybe we don't have enough applicants. But what we need to do is that to encourage younger individuals to take these paths and to learn these skills. So this is something that we have to focus on, a stigma that exists around these things, and we need to encourage individuals in terms of, just showing the earnings, as you mentioned. The type of jobs that could be available, the earnings that they can obtain. So this is something that the discussion should start even before high school, and also in discussion with parents.
I agree. I think we're going to take a final question, and then we're going to wrap up.
My name is Renee. I'm a member of, and I'm a retired banker, I'm a member of a group of 12 that meet every month to discuss topics. Most of the members are retired professionals and entrepreneurs. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, the impact of AI and what will happen down the road with respect to AI. Of course, we have a lot of unknowns in that area. Secondly, the number of people that are currently floating around in Canada that are now basically undocumented because they haven't gone home is a significant problem. The federal government has estimated it's anywhere between 600,000 and 800,000. You've said that it's possibly even more. Then, of course, there are another 3 million in the hopper of temporary residents whose permits are going to be coming up. How is that going to be solved? We do not currently have any kind of system to chase people down, to say, it's time to leave, goodbye. Thirdly, I'd like to thank the entire panel, the people that organized this, for bringing the subject of immigration up. It's a very important subject. In the past, 5 years ago, it would have been a taboo subject. Not now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, do you want to start with do you have anything to say on the AI?
Yeah, actually, I did publish something a couple of weeks ago on AI with colleagues, and it's a really long answer, so I'll give the short answer is that, there's a dystopian path, and then there's kind of this famous chart that's circulating on social media right now, which is like AI could be like this, or it could be like that, or it could be like that. So basically nobody knows the impact that AI will have on labor markets and on welfare, on well-being of Canadian citizens. But in part we don't know because it's going to be policy driven to some extent. And so, but we don't yet have enough policies and policy discussions on the table yet, even in Canada, to figure out, how is it going to impact our lives.
So do you have anything you want to say to all of that, particularly the second part?
I forgot them.
No, I'll tell you what, I will wrap up here by a small bit of an answer to that second part. So I do talk a bit about this at the end of my book, and I say that, so a number of things are going to happen. And you can already see it in what the Carney government announced in their immigration targets. So they said the immigration targets for the permanent immigration number for the next few years will be 380,000. It's important to understand that of those 380,000, probably about half, maybe more, will come from people who are already in Canada as permanent residents. So that's partly how you get the 3 million down. In addition, the Carney government also said on top of the 380,000, there are going to be 148,000 people over the next 2 years who are already in Canada who will get permanent residency, but for some reason we won't count in the permanent resident number. So I think you're going to see a lot of, that's the easiest thing to do, but it's also a frustrating thing to do because it means you are taking away from the highly skilled immigrants you could bring in from overseas. You're using most of your immigration to keep people, to give permanent residency to people who are already here. And so there are some downsides to that because you may be choosing some people who are actually kind of low skilled, using category-based selection, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, those two initiatives, the one-time initiatives, I believe they are above the targets that they announce, and those that they will come through refugee program. They are already they are already made a decision about those. These individuals are supposed to become permanent immigrants, but just because the limit is going to take years, now they are going to do it in 2 years.
Yeah, so they're already here, and they've already been accepted, and it's going to be sped up. So, and that's one way to bring the 3 million down. Anyways, there's lots to talk about there. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Parissa, Rebecca, thank you very, very much for being here. We're going to turn this over to Jennifer to wrap it up.
Great. I just wanted to say a few things in closing. Before I get to my thanks, it is a great privilege to be able to direct a public policy school in Canada, in a country where we're still trying to have difficult conversations. And we're trying to have them in public. And this lecture series that has traveled across Canada has brought out a lot of Canadians to talk about this issue. And you'll see in Tony's book, you won't agree with every line. I didn't agree with every line in the book. But you'll see at the end, despite everything that he talked about tonight with the data, he advocates for still very high levels of Canadian immigration, still a very generous refugee approach. This is about thinking about how public policy has evolved over the last decade and how we can think about public policy in the future. I just want to say a couple of thanks of my own before we welcome you to continue the conversation. First of all, I'd like to thank Ken White, who's with us tonight, who is the publisher of Sutherland Press, who's our partner in this enterprise of putting on the Max Bell Lectures and helped to publish Tony's book, Borderline Chaos. So thank you very much to Ken. And again, to Tom Kierans, who made this lecture series possible. I want to thank my colleagues from the Max Bell School who are here, Pinaki, Shantae, Adriana, and at the very back, Christopher Reagan, who was the founding director of the Max Bell School, and the brains behind conceiving of the economics lecture series and inviting Tony to give this year's lectures. I want to thank Parissa and Rebecca for joining us for this conversation. Also to the Toronto Public Library for hosting us. And last but not least, to Tony Keller for taking up our invitation to write a short book and to engage with Canadians in a conversation about immigration. So please join us for a drink and some food if you're able to stay. And if you have more questions, and of course, Tony would be delighted to sign your book. Good night, everyone.